Your friend and mine, Joe Rogan, the biggest podcast on the planet, has eked a new Spotify deal at 250 million. People were speculating that Joe Rogan would end up going back to the way it was in 2019 on Spotify, on YouTube full podcast, and it would be on every other platform. And it wouldn't be specifically for Spotify. Because for me personally, I only started using Spotify because of Joe Rogan. And you go, why? For one, I would always have my podcast subscriptions pop up in the Podcast Go app. Every podcast I would listen to would just pop up with Joe Rogan's and everything, because typically I don't sit back and watch podcasts. I just listen to the audio versions of the podcast, if that makes sense to you. So, as a fan of Joe Rogan and as a fan of his podcast, and it being the biggest podcast of all time, I can understand why it's valued so high. And the reason it's the most successful podcast ever is not just because of its Joe Rogan. It's because he has interesting topics, from martial artists, from drug dealers, mobsters, scientists, you name it, he's done it. And that is why it's not a standalone podcast based upon one topic. It's a topical podcast. No, it's a conversational podcast. So we can talk about anything and everything. And that is why he is so successful, because a lot of these podcasts stick to one topic and they can't really elaborate on other things. So that's why he is the biggest podcast. And he's been doing it pretty much longer than most of these dudes on the planet. Do I think he's worth $250 million? That's a lot, my guy. A lot. So he's had everybody from Mike Tyson, Joey Coco Diaz, Theo Vaughn, Neil deGrasse Tyson, all on his show. So that is why it's so successful. And he's a guy who's never done podcasts by himself. He's done podcasts in airplanes, in cars, recorded it on his cell phone. But the thing about it is, he's not doing like Theo Vaughn or one of these other people that will just do a podcast for like an hour by himself. He just doesn't do that. So he's always innovating by having the best studio, the best audio quality, maybe not the best so-called video quality, but he's putting in the work to make it the most professional. It's a conversation, two people sitting down talking about a topic, and it can go from anywhere from somebody's childhood to somebody's religious beliefs, to from Joey Diaz, Bert Kreischer, Tom Segura, Alex Jones, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Ben Shapiro, all these people that you know are going to be interesting characters to listen to. This is back in the day when Joe Rogan was always having Joey Diaz on the platform, and Joey Diaz would rant and go crazy. But in the very beginning, it was just Joe and his friends in a house in his little office, and that's all it was those dudes in the office shooting the shit. And it wasn't and the thing about it that I liked back then, it was very raw, like locker room talk. You'd have Joey Diaz ranting about something crazy. You'd have guests over and they would just be talking about anything and everything. Yes, it's more commercialized. Yes, it's more about a business now than it was just a bunch of dudes just shooting the breeze and talking about anything and everything. But again, there's similar podcasts today, like the Church What's Happening Now with Joey Diaz. You have the Patrick Bet David podcast. You have Impulsive with the Paul brothers, like Logan Paul. But again, nothing's going to ever be like the original. Joe Rogan is worth the money he is because he's innovative. He's put out the most podcasts, like 2,100 episodes from MMA. And like I said, any topic you could think of, Joe Rogan has talked about. But it's always, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Is Joe Rogan really worth this kind of money, or do you guys not enjoy his stuff? For me personally, I think he is a good platform. I think he's had a lot of guests on there. I would love to see Cat Williams on there. I would love to see like Stone Cold Steve Austin. I think that would be a very interesting podcast. But at the end of the day, my guys, I just enjoy free-flowing conversation because I'm a dude who doesn't care what people talk about. If it's interesting, I'll tune in. If it's not, I tune out. So as always, that is why Joe Rogan is worth $250 million.